My thanks to Deacon Marion for inviting me to be here. I'm Bill Hinrichs. She said rector of St. John's, Cohoes. Let me just begin by sharing a story I ran across a few years ago. A young couple were engaged to be married. Both were very committed to their faith, but they went to different churches. And so once they announced their engagement, they decided they would visit each other's churches to learn about their faith background. The young man was an Episcopalian. He belonged to a high church Anglo-Catholic parish. So when they got there, her eyes were about to bug out of her head. She was filled with questions. From the moment the bell rang before worship started, ding, what does that mean? That means we're about to stand up and sing a hymn. When the deacon, the acolytes process down the aisle, what does that mean? Well, we stand because Christ is in our midst. Throughout the whole service, what does that mean? What does that mean? What does that mean? He patiently answered all her questions. The next week, they went to her church, a Baptist church. Quite a contrast. Everyone sat in their pews. He sat and watched. Didn't have any questions. And then at the end, it came time for the sermon. Preacher mounted the pulpit, took off his watch, held it up for all to see, placed it down, and he said, what does that mean? She said, that doesn't mean a thing. Well, I will try to glance at it, be respectful of your time. The gospel we just heard, Deacon Lynn read, a man who was paralyzed was healed by Jesus. The same Jesus is risen and heals us today. The man in the gospel story was physically paralyzed. Jesus also spoke about sin that needed to be forgiven. Many of us may never be paralyzed physically, but we can have inner scars that paralyze us from living life the way God intends us to, that paralyze us from interacting with others. The same Jesus wants to heal those inner wounds as well. I want to share with you an experience I had of being healed of an inner wound, an inner scar. And the first piece is simply becoming aware of the need for healing. Years ago, I served as rector of St. Barnabas of the Valley in Cortez, Colorado. This is the southwest corner of the state. This is cowboy country. One of the members of our congregation named Paul was a sheep herder. He loved riding his horses out through the mountains, caring for his sheep. Paul was over-endowed with testosterone. He was every he-man's dream of being a he-man. But Paul was angry at the church. Paul was angry at his wife. Paul was angry at God. Paul came to me regularly for counseling. And no matter where we started the conversation, it all went downhill. Paul and I would end up in a conflict. We would end up misunderstanding each other. And finally, I had an insight. And I told Paul, I chose to become vulnerable. I said, Paul, when I was little, my mother hung around with friends, and their children, instead of playing with me, they beat me up. That was their favorite pastime, beat up on Billy. And I said, ever since, when I'm around tough macho guys, I just feel paralyzed. I feel I can't be myself. To which Paul responded, he said, well, you know, from what I've shared with you, I hate my father. I have issues with any father figure. When I come in to meet with you, the first thing I see on your door, Father Bill. And I'm off to the races. We realized we both had inner scars that needed healing. So I suggested that we go off to a monastery in Pecos, New Mexico, where they specialized in healing, but especially inner healing. Now, let me rewind the clock a bit. My maternal grandmother grew up in what is called a Cohoes community. They're people who were in many ways like the Shakers. They lived in a community in Florida. Men and women lived separately. If they arrived married, they were separated, and the children were put in separate quarters. Any affection between the husbands and wives was discouraged. Any affection between the parents and the children was discouraged. That was the atmosphere in which my grandmother grew up. She married my grandfather, and she had one child, my mom. My English grandfather, my Cohoes grandmother, neither one knew how to be affectionate. That was the world my mother grew up in. So it's not surprising that my mother herself, she was loving, she was caring, but she didn't have a lot of resources to draw on to be an affectionate mommy. When she would go to visit with her friends, and she'd say, go off and play with Gary and Tommy and Mike. I hated it because I knew that before long, there'd be some reason why they'd be pounding on Billy. And I would run to my mom and cry to her and just say, Mommy, I don't want to be with them. And she would say, be a man, stand up to them, go back. And I went back. That left me with some deep scars, as I discovered in my visiting with Paul. I think it was probably my early 30s, when I had that conversation with Paul, I realized that something had to change. So we went to a week-long retreat at the Pecos Abbey in New Mexico. They had prayer for inner healing. They had group prayer, individual prayer. Toward the end of our week there, we had time to meet one-on-one with members of the prayer team, with some of the monks and sisters there. Because curiously enough, it is the only Roman Catholic monastery that is both male and female. Like the Cohoes community, they don't live together. But they bring the gifts of both men and women together in the world there. I met with a prior, and I told him a little bit about the boys who beat up on me. And he said, do you feel ready to forgive these boys? I said, yes, I'm ready to forgive them. So he had me just relax, be still, took me through a little exercise where I relaxed my toes, my legs, my whole body. And he said, now picture yourself with your mom and her friends and the other boys. Tell me what you see. I said, we're off in the corner of the garden. Not sure what we're doing. And my mom is talking to her friends up on the porch. He said, name each boy by name and tell them you forgive them. I said, Tommy, I forgive you. Each one, and name by name, each one, I said, I forgive you. And as I was picturing this scene, suddenly something happened that I'd never experienced, but I longed for. I saw my mother get up, leave her friends, come up to me, embrace me, and in that moment, I felt a profound infusion of maternal love that I longed for, but never experienced. A gift of God's grace, God's healing. I felt released from my paralysis. I felt I could go back and face people like Paul again without being hindered by my own scars. Back home, we did go back. I won't say we became best friends, but we could certainly sit in the same room and know that God is good, God is gracious, God heals, And that is very, very real. And I've shared that with you in the name of the healing Lord. Amen. Actually, that was very short. If you'll bear with me, I asked my wife on the way up, which story should I tell? And she said, tell me one about the Pecos. Share with you also, because for me, inner healing is a way of experience Jesus' healing power. My sister was healed of MS in a very powerful healing. But that's her story, not my story. I believe that even the best of parents at times say and do things that can hurt their children inadvertently. My parents were good parents. Both of them left their own scars in my life. My father particularly. I grew up with an alcoholic father. When my brother and I were little, we would stand by the window and watch for Daddy to come back from work. We could tell by the way he drove the car down the driveway if it was good Daddy or bad Daddy. Good Daddy was sober and felt immensely guilty for how he behaved when he'd been drinking. He would shower us with gifts. He'd play with us. He'd tell us stories. If he'd been drinking, watch out. There was a temper. The belt came out. The first 9 years of my life, my dad drank heavily. How heavily? So much so that he couldn't get out of bed in the morning without a drink. He kept the flask hidden in his nightstand. He had to have a drink before he could even step out of bed. When I was about 4 or 5, I was watching for my dad to come home from work. He didn't come. My mom put us to bed. And shortly thereafter, the doorbell rang. It was a neighbor from across the street. It seems my dad, in trying to go down our driveway, had put the car in reverse and backed up and plowed into our neighbor's house and then passed out cold. They came in, get him out of our house, get the car out of the driveway, take your husband back. My mom, a young mother, was beside herself. The neighbor did drive the car out of his driveway. And then my mom, and because I grew up in Mexico, we had a servant. My mom and the servant carried my dad into the living room. They laid him on the sofa. And my mom just sat there in the dark living room, sobbing, bawling her eyes out, weeping inconsolably. And I stood on the steps just outside the living room. And somehow, being the eldest in the family, I felt I had to fix this. So I came up with a plan. I would go to the kitchen. I would get the biggest knife I could find. I would go to the living room. I would stab Daddy. Mommy would stop crying. She'd hug me. We'd be all happy ever after. I did not go for the knife. I did not stab my dad. On November 20th, 1959, my dad chose, with the help of AA and the grace of God, not to have a drink, and he never touched a drink after that. I have a sister. My sister never knew an alcoholic dad. My brother and I did. Things changed tremendously once my dad stopped drinking. But there was still an edge to our relationship. We weren't dysfunctional, but there was something between us. In my late 20s, I went to a session of the School of Healing Prayer started by Agnes Sanford, one of the pioneers in healing prayer in the Episcopal Church. And as part of the conference there, a woman named Leanne Payne led the group through a group prayer session. And it was the same as it was in Pecos, where at first they had us just relax our body completely. And then after it was all relaxed, Leanne said, now picture yourself in the most relaxing spot you've ever been in. For me, that was in the ocean by the city of Acapulco. We went there often to vacation. And not only would we take a glass-bottom boat out to an island so we could look at the tropical fish below, but I also got to swim around the water with my visor on, just watch the fishies there. And just float in the water, watching the fishies. That was the most relaxing I could imagine. So I pictured myself there. And then Leanne said, now, picture Jesus near you. Well, not far from where I was imagining myself floating in the water, I knew there was a statue of the Virgin Mary. So I just saw that as a statue of Jesus. And then Leanne said, now, tell God whatever's in your heart. I had no idea what to say. But I did notice that while my legs were relaxed, my left hand was all relaxed, my face was relaxed, my right hand was in a tight, tight fist. And the statue of Jesus came to life. And he came towards me. And he held out his hand. And I knew what I was holding was that knife from when I was 4 or 5. I had a choice. I could continue life holding on to that. It was time to let go. Jesus didn't scold. He just waited. As I sat there in prayer, I held my hand out. I let go. And again, the strong embrace of Jesus and a love that I long for. And that conference on, there was a change in my relationship with my Father. The edge was gone. There was a healing there. It's as if Jesus said to me, get up and walk. Journey together with your dad. Journey together with your mom. Sure, that's true too. In the name of the risen Jesus, who healed us and makes us whole.